Okay, we're gonna get started with lecture in a second here. So move up to the front if you want. If you're good there, that's fine too. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sick of you, but I know you guys will be sick of me. Because even better news, me and KV switch lectures. So I'm with you guys tomorrow as well. You'll never escape me. Yeah. So cool. Hope the Wednesday morning has been treating you well. Today we're looking at Ajax. Oh, I gotta turn on my little doodle brush. So we talked about client-side JavaScript yesterday, and we saw some benefits of it, mainly being able to manipulate. Oh, spoilers. Okay, this is a good spoiler. Mainly being able to manipulate the DOM and update like elements. Also do some cool maybe like animation or more designy flair to our websites. And today we're going to look at the other really powerful thing that we can do with client-side JavaScript, and it's called Ajax. It stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Another great move by the ethos of naming that is our programming brethren, always just hitting it out of the park with great, easy-to-understand names. This is Ajax, right, guys? Like asynchronous JavaScript and XML. We all know what that means. So we'll skip over that part. Just kidding. We're going to look at the browser in Ajax. What are the motivations for using this thing called Ajax? When we can't use Ajax, what do we do? And a couple other kind of pro tips, I guess, around Ajax. So what is it? It's not this guy. But it is asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It allows us to send and receive data from a server asynchronously. Practically, this means we can change content dynamically without reloading our page. We can get new content from our server anytime we want on the front end. It's a combination of a browser object called the XML HTTP request object and client-side JavaScript and HTML. Ajax requests can be done in pure JavaScript, but we're going to be looking at doing them with jQuery. Because we're learning jQuery yesterday and we're continuing using it throughout Twitter. We'll look at briefly how you do it in pure JavaScript. It's not too different, but Ajax, like it does, makes it a bit easier. Just as a quick kind of like, what the heck is this? So who has heard of XML? Is this something? Cool. What's XML to you? It's the suckier version of JSON. Kind of, yeah, the less successful brother of JSON. So XML looks like this. We can see some here. Maybe we'll just look at an image. So here's an example of what XML looks like. Does it remind us of anything? Just looking like this. Yeah, it looks a bit like HTML. So there is a subset of XML, XHTML, that is formatted, the same way that XML is. We got our old friend. What? HTML in here. So when we're talking about asynchronous JavaScript and XML, originally the idea was we can make requests from our browser to other services and get back XML. Again, not a great move on their naming. because XML is not the big name in web development as they maybe thought it was. But we're thinking that our HTTP requests are going to be returning XHTML, or they're going to be returning either HTML or JSON things. The naming just comes from the earlier age when that was a standard of kind of data formatted text. Sweet. Any questions? I think we're just going to jump into some code and see how it works, but any thoughts at this point? So my thinking was we could use, there's a really cool API called the Poke API. It gives us a bunch, like kind of too much information on Pokemon. We can get, as we saw here, just kind of basic information on a particular Pokemon, but they have like just pages and pages of, there's a surprising amount of information on berries. But everything in the game is in here. We're going to make maybe like a Pokédex. So something like this, where the user, it'll be a single page application, can do a search of maybe like a Pokemon or a number, and dynamically get back their name, picture, information, whatever we want to pull from this API. And we'll do it dynamically so that we don't see like a big page refresh. And we talked about this kind of at the end of yesterday's lecture, but again, the big distinction and the big difference we'll see today is like the difference between Wikipedia, where we're clicking on different pages and we're seeing a refresh. There is a full standard HTTP request to the browser, or to the Wikipedia server, which is returning new resources for us, an HTML page, CSS, and probably some JavaScript for this page. So we're requesting the server and getting back a full new like layout. Whereas with something like Reddit, as we saw yesterday, when we click on different things, we don't get a page refresh, but we do get full new content. And most likely what's happening here is we're getting a request to the server handled through Ajax, and the server is returning back data, probably in the form of JSON. And then based on that response, we're getting a new rendering of the page. So traditional non-asynchronous requests, new asynchronous requests. The other way to think of it is like a traditional web page versus a single page application. You need asynchronous requests in order to do a single page application in your browser. So we're going to whip up this project. I've got a little folder here, code. And I figured we could go through the like HTML and CSS a little bit because it is front-end week. So we'll build that up. We won't spend too much time on it, but so we've got our HTML tag, our head tag for all of our metadata and our resources, and our body tag. We're going to get in a few resources. The first one, we will get a style sheet, using the rel to say that the relationship of this link is a style sheet, and the place we're getting that style sheet from will be in the same folder, and we'll just simply call it style.css. Not too far. And then we want a couple scripts in our project. So we want one script that we create, and this will include all of the logic for like fetching a Pokemon and updating our DOM elements, and we can just call this Pokédex.js. This is not created yet. We'll slap on a defer on here because we know we want it to load in later. And then lastly, we're going to want to get jQuery. And same process as yesterday. I'm going to search jQuery CDN. I could install, or install is not the right word, I could download the jQuery library and include it right here in the root of my folder, and then link to it the same way that I'm linking this Pokédex script. There could be another file here that is just jQuery, or usually a minified version. But we'll just get the hosted version and include that before our script. We can also toss on a defer on this as well. Purpose of this is not to set up like a server. We just want a front-end page that deals with an external API. So I might have already done it. Yeah, I'll redo it for you. All I have here, I'm in the folder where we've just created those couple files, index and Pokédex. And I want to have a server that just allows me to access the HTML file itself and request any resources that it needs, whether that be the JavaScript file or the CSS file, or maybe an image that I have in this folder. I don't want to create a full Express server just to do that, and you guys have seen Express servers being created. So there's a nice module called HTTP server. To install this, you would go npm install. You'd probably do it globally. HTTP server, like that. And then once you're in a folder with files that you want to serve, you would go http-server, and it spins up a really simple web server. This is on localhost 8080. So heading over to my browser, if I go to localhost 8080, this is probably my IP, and this one is the, yeah. So like either of these would work. In fact, I could probably, if you guys visit this one, you'll be able to like see the application itself. Yeah. So here we have it. It's an empty screen. Nothing's happening, but I can also make requests to the other files in this folder. So let's just, hey, this is some text. By default, it's going to look for something called index when you don't give it a path. But if you are looking for something specific, so if we're looking for Pokédex.js, we can get that file as well. So it's just an access point to our directory. If I put an image in there called dog.jpg and I went dog.jpg, it would show that image. So that's HTTP server. Next, we'll just fill out how we want our Pokédex to look like. So I'm going to make a div that's going to be the Pokédex itself. Pokédex. And then inside of it, we will have a title where we just declare that it is a Pokédex. We will then have like, we already kind of saw the plan. But if we look at Pokédex, I was thinking a screen with our image, the name might be at the top, our description might be at the bottom. So we could do like their name, and then a div, a screen. And inside we have like a single image that has some dynamically received sprite. Underneath, we'll just do a simple p tag, and this will eventually be our description. For now, maybe we'll put a default image in here so that we can get the styling of our thing looking right with like a real potential image. Anyone got a favorite Pokemon? Pikachu. Too classic, too classic. Mudkip is a nice take. So if we just look here, this is our base URL, and then we have different endpoints that we can use. Like if we wanted to look for berries and make a Pokédex for berries, we could do / I think it's like berries and then whatever. But our path is Pokemon, and then we can either do a name or we can do like a number. So Mudkip works. This is the data that would be returned to us. We get a bunch of information on like abilities. I guess all the games that this guy appears in. Maybe. His moves, species, which is weird to me because I thought their name was just like, the species is just Mudkip. Why do you need to specify that? And then sprites, which is cool. So we got a bunch of, back, front, shiny sprites. We'll grab the default for Mudkip. Paste that in there. And then, we did have the style, so we'll add a new style.css. So the Pokédex itself, we'll make it, I don't know, like 500 pixels wide. I want it in the center, so I'm going to say margin left auto, margin right auto. We need those aesthetic rounded corners. You can't escape. So we'll do border dash radius, and we'll try 30 pixels and see how that looks. And then we need a background color. Something like this red. So we'll look up like a color picker. Oh, nice. We'll use that one. And then maybe a padding of like 20 pixels. We'll see how that looks. Inside our Pokédex, we have the title, the name, and then a screen with an image inside. We can probably leave these with default styles unless we wanted to, like, I don't know, make them bigger or smaller. They might be fine. And then we'll get the screen. Our screen is like this. I guess this one just has a white background. But for some reason in my memory, all of the Pokédex screens have like, oh yeah, here it is. This like screen green color. That's pretty decent. So our screen is inside of the Pokédex. We want to be somewhat specific. Maybe we have more screens in the future. So I'll do that. These screens that are children of the Pokédex should have a background color of our green. We'll also give them a border radius of, I guess, same. And then our screen has an image inside of it. We'll get that image to fill 100% of the width that it can, and then the height we'll keep auto so that we keep the aspect ratio. If we grow it in this dimension, we don't get a like stretched out Mudkip. We get like a normal looking one. And that might be, we'll check it now. Oh, look at that guy. Looks okay. Any suggestions? Some borders around both, or which one? Both? What color border should we use? Like a grayish color? So around both of these we wanted 3 pixels, solid color. Okay. Sweet. So we have, we didn't fill in any name or description. I could pull that statically down. But the idea is we want to dynamically pull in all of this information from our API here. So we're going to have to do that over in our script. Just like yesterday, we can use the handy document ready to make sure that everything is good to go before we run any of this code. I'm going to grab this URL and save it to just kind of like a global variable, or I guess a ready wide variable called URL. Because we might be doing multiple requests, and that way we have a single reference point. And if we decide to change it from the Pokey API version 1 to 2, or from 2 to 1, or we need to edit this in any time in the future, we have a single point for doing so. Next, there's kind of like 2 goals that we want to accomplish. We want to update the Pokédex DOM. Like we want to have a function maybe that takes in information and changes what we get here. And then we also maybe want a function that gets the new Pokemon data. We'll start with the Ajax-y stuff first. Const get Pokemon. Eventually, maybe our function will take in a parameter of like a search parameter. Because we saw with our API that we can give Mudkip we can give like a name, or someone, what's a number from like 1 to, it's like almost 1,000 these days. 250. Who's that guy? Ho-ho. So our user can probably type in a name or a number, and given that this endpoint is flexible, whether we do that or Mudkip, we can account for both. So we're taking a generic search, and then this is our first Ajax request. So we're going to do $, because it is a jQuery method. We don't need to do an Ajax request on something, so we're just going to do dot, and then we're going to do Ajax. This method is going to take one parameter where we specify the details of our request. So what are we doing? Are we doing a GET request, a POST request? Where is it going to? Do we need to set any additional headers? Any information or things that differ from one request to another, we can specify in this kind of like config object. So one key value pair is just the URL that we're making a request to. And we're going to go to our root URL, and then we want to do /Pokemon/ and this would be like our search. Hopefully like a number or like a real Pokemon. This function is going to return a promise. It's asynchronous. It takes time, so we can't get the result of what we can't go result equals whatever. There's some time delay for reaching out to the Pokemon API and getting something back. The two major ways that we've seen of handling asynchronous things are through callbacks and through promises. Promises, hopefully at this point, I know the syntax initially is a little bit hard, but we're starting to feel that they are a little bit better of an approach than callbacks. So we have two ways of handling the eventual resolution of this callback. We can do a .then. And we should also usually do a .catch in case something went wrong. So for instance, if we're making a request to here and we give like some garbage string, we might need to handle that request not completing in our .catch. In both of these, a parameter is going to be passed back. In the successful completion of our request, we're going to get a response. When our response fails, we might get an error back. So to start, let's just see what we get back from this request. It's a function, so we have to call it, and we have to pass it some parameter. If we want Pikachu, we can try that. And hopefully if we refresh this, we now get our response logged to our console here. And this is exactly the data that the Poke API returns. This here, we now are receiving in our browser, but we've done it asynchronously. Whoa! Although not really exciting at this point because we are doing it immediately when the page loads, right? So if we're doing it right when the page loads, there's really no difference as to if we got it from the server or if we got it, after the fact from the server. This doesn't make it, I mean, it's cool because it's a different way, but it doesn't really, from a, use case standpoint, help us in any way. What we want to do next is be able to take this information or maybe take this function and use it when a user wants to, so when they submit to a form. One thing we can check when you're doing asynchronous requests, there's another handy tab here. It's your network tab. You can see at the top, there's all these different tabs. You can filter what requests are being made by the browser down to all of these different divisions. So you can see what JavaScript files is my browser requesting. Oh, it's requesting the Pokedex.js. It's also requesting jQuery and all of these other things. What CSS files am I getting? Oh, style.css. The reason it's showing up multiple times here is because I've refreshed multiple times and it remembers the history beyond a single request. Like we could clear this, do a single, and then we should see just one CSS file coming in. Our little screen here shows the timing of when these requests are made. One thing that we might not have thought about is our server, whether it be an Express server when you were doing EJS templates or our kind of lightweight HTTP server right now, the initial resource that it sends down to the client is only the index HTML page. The client then reads your head and then makes subsequent requests to each of the LinkedIn resources, so to your CSS, to your script. So that stuff's even done asynchronously. I always have a super hard time. Yeah, so at around 100 milliseconds, that style.css is being loaded in. Same probably with our Pokedex thing. Right at the start, they both are not there. So they're still being grabbed after the fact. But down the line, I think it's probably this guy here. No. We're also getting a request that's showing up here. Now it'll show up in all, but the tab XHR, that's standing for that XML HTTP request object. So these are all asynchronous JavaScript requests that occur in your application. So we have one occurring, it's occurring after the initial page load, after the resources load, way down here, 300 milliseconds. We can look at the headers of our request. We see that it is to the Poke API. We're doing the method get, and then the response headers. And then over here, we can actually see the response that was sent back. So this big JSON string. This is handy because sometimes you'll be making requests client side and like it'll fail and you kind of have to debug what's going on. So for example, if we do that, this is not a real route for the Poke API. And if we refresh, you see this new request showing up. The request is to that garbage path, but the status was 404, meaning like there was no route found for that. We can look through the response headers to see if there's any additional information on why it failed. If we are in a case where we need to authenticate ourselves to the API, there might be something in a response header that says like, hey, no authentication. And then our response to, we're also getting the message not found. So use this network tab to like see what is happening when you're making your asynchronous requests. And you can see like how many are going out, how many are succeeded, what is coming back. I mean, you can get into timing and cookies and other things, but mostly you're going to be concerned with this like response and the headers that are happening. For our application next, let's just make the function where we update the Pokédex. This will take in like a Pokemon object that has all of the like name, description, image data that we need. And we will use the Pokédex, and our h2 was our name. So we want to target the Pokédex h2 and set the text to be the Pokemon. And we haven't decided on a convention of how this object is going to be made, but we'll just decide now that it should have a property or a key called name. And then the next thing we need to set is the Pokédex paragraph tag dot text. And again, we're deciding now that the Pokemon should have a description. And then the last thing was for our screen and the image, we don't want to set the text. We want to set an attribute. So with jQuery, we can update attributes and give it two parameters, the first being the attribute that we want to change. So we want to update the source attribute, and we want to set it to Pokemon like image. just to test this in isolation from our get Pokemon thing right now, we can do update Pokédex name, test, description, test, description, and then image, just some garbage. So when this script loads, it creates these two functions. It attempts to update the Pokédex, and it also does that asynchronous request for Pokemon number 25. So we're getting the test name, we're getting the test description, and just checking the image, we are getting that like fake image that we're putting there. So that seems to be all right. Next, we'll try and integrate this function into our get Pokemon. So like somewhere in here, we want to update the Pokemon. What might be a good choice here is to start with some default values so that as we're trying to get stuff, if we fail, we can still set the Pokemon to like some default stuff. So we have a default name maybe, we have a default description, and then we have a default image. I mean, could do something just like null or like, I don't know, like not found or not found. Maybe our description will be question marks. But in Pokemon, there's a perfect representation of not being able to find a Pokemon. What is that? There we go. So, and this is like back in blue and red, I think. And the funny thing about this was like it's literally a programming problem where the encounter is searching for a number out of the index of what, like 1 to 151, and that's why it's saying missing known. Like the return of whatever they're using to get a Pokemon is saying like, hey, missing number, like that doesn't exist. But they didn't obviously create a guard between that and just showing it to the user. So the name comes up as missing no, and then it probably looks at like the next address in memory to find like an image or something. And because it's not a real Pokemon, the next address in like memory is not like a real image. And so this is just like raw data from the game being like just shown as like an image format. It's super cool. So let's look up. Is there? I guess I just spell it correctly. So we'll throw that in as the default image, and then as the default name. But if we do find something, we want to replace that. So getting the response, we want to go Pokemon.name equals something. Pokemon.image equals something. Pokemon.description equals something. Looking back to the API, because there's a lot of stuff in here, there is just a base key in the root of the object called name. So we can probably just go response.name. Images we kind of saw earlier were in the sprites. So sprites itself is an object and then has a bunch of these keys. We'll probably go with the front default. So we can go response.sprites, the sprites object, and then the front default. The next one poses a bit of a problem, because if throughout this, and you might kind of have to trust me on it because there's a lot of stuff, we don't have the description in this endpoint. Like the Poke API has that, but not here. So we have to look down in the species object. There's a reference to another API endpoint. So where we're going Pokemon species / and then a Pokemon number. This is somewhat common in APIs where they'll say, okay, we have so much information back here on a particular thing. We don't want to send it all with every request to say Pikachu because you're only going to be using certain things. If we do it all the time, it's going to be really costly for us as an API because it's larger chunks of data that we're sending every time. It's also going to be harder for you as the user because you're going to have to filter through these giant things. Instead, we'll break it up into different endpoints and just link you the locations where you can get additional information if you need to. So we can get, if we put this in, actually let's grab the end and paste it here. We can get this other chunk of JSON, which has stuff like flavor text entries. And these are all of the descriptions for this Pokemon, for every game and a bunch of different languages. So there's a lot of stuff in here. But we can see right here, here's one that we might want to be able to use. But again, it doesn't exist in our initial response, but we do have the reference to it under species.url. So we can't do this right now. But we do have a new species endpoint, and that is the response.species.url. So what might we do at this point if we don't have everything, but we have this new place we can request for information? Yeah, we're going to have to do another request. And because it's all happening client side asynchronously, we can totally do that. But first, let's test if these two together are working. So we'll just do an update Pokédex with our Pokemon. We will be getting the default description because that's not being overridden. I'm also going to throw this in the catch here so that if we do something wrong, we'll just get the default missing note showing up. And then lastly, we're still going to have to call this manually. Get Pokemon. But if we've done it correctly, we should see, we get Pikachu, we get his correct image. We don't get his description because we haven't found that yet. But it's a good start. We'll probably break there for 15 minutes, come back at 11. But before we do, any questions on our initial setup? Especially for this file and our Ajax request. Cool. During the break, try and think of anything that's weird about this. I'll leave it up, and we can start with questions when we come back as well. Yeah.
The scripts.
Yeah.
Script text. Then you also use
Yeah.
jQuery.
Yeah.
So if you use
You don't need to for like being safe. Like I'm not going to get an error that I couldn't find in this case like any of these elements. There's still a bit of a reason to use defer because I'm pushing the load time of these scripts down to after everything else loads. So it's just like, hey, before you even read this script file, load in all of the HTML. So that can be helpful when you have heavy scripts. In this case, if I removed both defers, there would be pretty much no noticeable difference, but that would be like the motivation.
I was bored though. When I do this, right? Now,
Yeah.
wait, do you watch Twitch or what?
Sometimes, yeah.
I had Kev W, but yeah. Anyways, okay. So, right now I'm just trying to like make it so it's in a sense where like things start recycling.
Yeah.
So I want to start small. Right? I want to start like I can the arrow.
Yeah.
So. Ready? Do this. Changing the right here to pixels. But notice with this when I do, you know what I mean? Is it because I'm doing something, or is it because once like is it because I'm testing wrong, or is it because my code is wrong?
Probably your code here. So you could also you can see whether or not a media query is being applied even in here. So you're setting max width 750.
Oh, you want to?
So we should be. Actually. So it's not showing up here. Wait, what are you applying it to? Everything?
No, just the arrow,
just
the bobbing.
Yeah.
Because I want to start small, right? I don't want to like.
Oh.
When you click on it, so when you click on it, it's like a
I did it in red.
That's all it shows.
Yeah, so it's not being grabbed. There is no.
That means
You have to like. Yeah, like only screen is just saves you checking for other stuff. Oh, so easy to memory edit. Dude, you can
like I don't need to have the same like properties, right?
your computer, your character.
Like, even though I have like all this. Okay. Okay. I see what you're doing. Bruh. Bruh. Like you know what I mean? So I don't know if it's like the way usually when you care about these type of things it's because it's small.
Yeah.
In the real What do you can't design mobile? Get the fuck out.
No, yeah, it's. And where are you including this? Okay. Um.
I'm sorry, bro. I'm sorry.
And all of this stuff is working, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's why it's like hovering, bobbing, like keyframe. Just the. Is it media query? At media query? Because I read. Thing. It's just like at media. Compass says that too. Or no? Is it because we have to?
How do you? Okay.
Oh, I saw flashing.
Yeah. So what it is?
Well, I actually have to size it.
So what it is I didn't realize actually that
that thing. Yeah, this is
responsive to
yeah.
it. I knew that like your phone widths would do it, but
Okay,
so
to test it,
when
don't
you're
do
you
this.
no when you should do this,
Oh,
and
I
this
should.
this is good that it's showing up. So when you do a media query, phones and things are like virtual displays of the browser.
That's right.
Meaning, like here, when you're at, well, when you're not in mobile, your screen width for CSS is the actual width of the thing.
That's right.
Originally, when like mobile browsers came out, they're like there was no responsive design. So what they did was they just scaled down websites, and so they said, okay, the media size of this browser will be like 100 or like 200% of what it actually is. So for most responsive things, like the reason it's not triggering is because
It is responsive.
it's not
Scaling.
662 is not triggering the breakpoint because for responsive, its width is still
What, like
1,000 or whatever
okay.
it is. Like I don't even know if we can. But you got to do yeah, query. Wow.
Plug it in.
Yeah. Um, uh,
Code is working fine. It's the way we're.
Here, you need this tag in your HTML. So you say the viewport initial scale should be 1, meaning whatever the width of the phone is, if the phone is 500 pixels wide, that's the width that will be set in your
CSS.
yeah, your media query calculations.
Okay.
So if you do that, and then yeah, throw it there.
Oh, something. Oh,
Then
now it's like actually.
yeah,
Okay. Thanks, man.
no worries.
Appreciate your help. Now I can get.
Okay, we're gonna start back up. Did anyone think of any questions over the break there? How many Pokemon? Probably like 400. What are we at now? Who's Nezuko? Okay, so yeah, we need to do oops. Okay, well, 800 was a good guess because there was something at 800. 800, 820. No, 810. Oh, man, if 801. Oh, dude. That's crazy. 807 of them. Twice as many as there needs to be. Maybe not. I don't know. So we just left off. We can now dynamically get in a Pokemon with their name and image. We don't quite have their description yet. But we need to now get their description and also allow the user to actually type in and receive stuff. We'll start with the user maybe, because that'll give us like some more exciting Ajax that actually happens live. So I'm gonna put in a form here. I'll do an input, or maybe I'll do a label, search, and then an input, type, text, name, search. And we'll have a last input, which is just a submit. Don't need that guy. I'm going to give this input a ID so we can look it up easily. Search, submit. Cool. So we want to handle this form submit because right now, I click, the default action happens, and we get a page reload. We want to hijack that and have it use our get Pokemon function to find new data, and then use our update Pokédex thing to propagate it to our DOM. So we need to catch the submit event from the form. Anyone know how to do that? We will need to prevent default, but how do we get that event before we do that?
Get the form ID
So we need to get the form, and then we can do a dot submit, and we'll get the event, and in here we can do event dot prevent default. Let's see if that's working. Looks like we're grabbing the event. I mean, we can double. It's not refreshing, so we are, but we'll just double prove it. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Ah. So what do we want to do next? What information do we need? The path that the form submits to. So we already are going to just use our URL. But we want to get, like, if I type in 467, 567, I want to get that number somehow. So there's different ways we could do that. We could use like plain JavaScript and go event.target. That will be the form, and then we can like serialize all of the data from it. Or we could go, I name the input search, and we can get the value from search. Let's check that we're getting the right thing. So whatever we put in, we're now able to grab in our submit handler. So we can use our get Pokemon function.
What would the serialize do again?
So serialize looks at a form and finds all the inputs and creates an object out of those inputs where the key is the input's name and the value is the input's value, like whatever's put in there. That's really helpful if we have like maybe like a register form where we're putting in multiple pieces of data and we need to get all of them and work together.
But for that, don't you have to have that format available on the server side? Like you're getting a key value pair. So name and then value and then age and a value.
Yeah.
So when you're submitting it to the server side, the server needs to, or database needs to interpret that, hey, I'm getting a name key, and whatever value I'm getting, I need to put that on the name field on the server side.
Yes. Well, yes, in the sense that you should already be formatting your forms coherent with how you need data on your server side. So if you need a email, password, and username, like your input fields should be named, email, password, and use exactly the same format as it is server side. But now that we're doing things asynchronously, like we have intermediary steps before we send it to the server. So if we wanted to, like we could create like a request object where we build up however we want this data to look like. Search on the server side should be search field, and that will be search. And we can make it however we want. Although we don't want to be doing extra steps here if we don't have to. So that's why like it's nice to just set it up here, but that doesn't mean we can't do some extra validation or some extra checks in our JavaScript before we throw it over. Yeah. In our case, we don't really have like a more complex object or thing that we need to send. We just need a single value, whether that be a number or a string. And we can just use our existing function that will do the request given our search parameter, and then update the DOM using our function here. So I'm going to go get Pokemon. I'm going to pass in the search. And because we've already kind of tested these two functions, the idea is hopefully it should just work. So we give it like 50, whoa, infinity. Very Pokemon. 54. And we do a submit. Oh, and it's Psyduck. Or we do, what was that, 807? Who was that guy? Oh, he doesn't have a thing. Oh, interesting.
But shouldn't the default image pop up on 807?
But that's because what's happening in terms of our code, the response is coming back successfully, and then we're setting the image to response.sprites.frontDefault. And my thinking is because they're a newer generation, they're 3D sprites, they don't have like a front and back default. So this is returning null, and then we're getting that like thing. We could decide that we do response sprites front default, or if that's null, we do the existing Pokemon image. I don't know if this is better because now we're going to get 800. What? This guy's crazy. Hell yeah, brother. Oh, it's just, I guess some of them don't have sprites associated with them. This guy's cool. But yeah, so when they don't have a sprite, they're now getting the default image, but they're not really missing, no, we don't have the image for it. So we could set it to another, like just a big question mark if we wanted to. But maybe we'll just leave it like that for now. Sweet, but this is like kind of exciting, I guess, because we're putting in numbers and we're getting like new data to our application without having to refresh our page. And if we look over in our network, we have all of these requests that are going out and giving us back response data, and we're plugging that into our page. So just the flow. From our form, we are triggering a submit event. We are preventing the default of the event, which would refresh our page. We're then getting the search value from that input field. We're passing that to our getPokemon function. Our getPokemon function is making an asynchronous request to our defined API using the path Pokemon and then whatever our search parameter is. On success, we're building up a Pokemon like object with a name, image, and we're setting that information to our update Pokemon function. On failure, we're still doing the update Pokédex function, but we're using our default stuff. Over here, our update Pokédex is just taking the different DOM elements that need to be changed and applying new text or attributes to them. Last thing we want to do is we want to make another request to this species URL so we can get the actual description. So down here we can go .ajax. We don't actually need our URL because this should be the whole URL. URL, species URL, and then .then we'll maybe get a response. Call this species. What's a better way to do this? What was one of the main reasons that we started using callbacks? Yeah, what was the main reason we started using callbacks in JavaScript in general, not in this code particularly? Like, why do we use promises over callbacks? What problem did it help us avoid? Yeah, waterfall nesting, callback hell. If we have many asynchronous things, we start to get, I'm doing it very poorly, but we start to get, this like super nesting thing that makes it really confusing. But even here, we're using promises and we're getting like nested, we're getting back into callback hell. Like the whole purpose of our promises was to avoid that. So what we do here, instead of just calling another promise and nesting a .then, we're going to chain our promises. We're going to do a return. So when this promise resolves, we're starting another promise and we're returning that. We can then tag on another .then. And this will be triggered when whatever we return from our first .then is resolved. So then we're not getting deeper in our nesting thing. And then we can do like a whatever we get there. And then it also has the added benefit that this single catch will catch any errors that occur along our chain. So if this call fails or this call fails, the catch will pick it up. Move our update Pokemon down. Now we want to update the Pokemon description. Over here, this is the endpoint we're trying. Let's flavor text entries. So it has a root key called flavor text entries, which is an array. Each element in the array is an object that has the flavor text and the language that text is in. I've looked at a few other ones, and we're going to make a actually, I'm not sure. This is counter to my thoughts. Because one of the real approach, the approach that we should do is we should like kind of loop through these flavor text entries and look for one that has the language, English or whatever language we have set to. The hacky way would be looking for a pattern and saying like, oh, the third one always seems to be English, let's just do that. So we're going to go the hacky way. And we're going to get flavor text entries, and we'll try the third one and just show that for now. Dot flavor. Flavor text. We're going to get the third thing in there, and then we're going to get the flavor text. So we got the description here, and then if we try a different one, nice. I don't think if we go really high, it might stop working. Yeah, because we're not doing it in the best way. So probably for Gen 1, I think it's all 3. But you know, the good way would be to do a search through these flavor texts. Awesome. There's a bit more we can add to this, but let's kind of get a recap on Ajax before we go too much further. So it's not really relevant, but we have to start thinking about the why of asynchronous requests and the pros and cons of using that versus like a traditional request style. So one thing to remember is that when we're using browsers, they're tracking what sites have been visited and when. Asynchronous request by default doesn't use the history. So in our case, this might be fine, but what would be nice if I could like go back and get the previous Pokemon that was searched, or go forward and get like the next Pokemon. This becomes more apparent in like more complex single-page applications where you have like a register page and then you have like a user's page. And one, you want the user to be able to navigate between the two of them with the history. Second thing that becomes really important is I want to be able to share a link for my single-page application to a particular page, right? Like, I want to give someone our Pokedex slash Pikachu and have them come to this page, or slash another Pokemon and go to a particular page. Right now, no matter what they do, they're always going to end up on this like default page. So that's our first problem. We don't have history back and forward. We don't have pathing for different pages automatically. But the browser does provide a history API that you can use to interact with the browser history. You can push to it. You can pop stuff off of it. I mean, we can even look in here, and we can look at history dot back. Do we have to go window? History. Oh, I don't have a back. Makes sense, makes sense. We'll go to about, we'll try the same thing, and it takes us back. We can use the same history thing to see like the length. Our history length right now is 2, and there's also other stuff in here that we can experiment with for like pushing a state, replacing a state, and so on and so forth. So if we navigate from one single page application screen to another, we might want to push a state to the history so that it remembers that there's a difference between one screen and the other. But that's like obviously harder than just using normal requests. So that's one thing to think about when we're using asynchronous requests. What are the pros to using Ajax? Well, can you guys think of any pros just based on our small example and your interaction with like different websites that you visited? The syntax? Yeah, it can definitely be cleaner. It loads up less resources for sure. Every time we want new data from a traditional request, we have to make a request to the server which fills in the data, but then also resends us all of our HTML, all of our CSS, all of our JavaScript, and so that comes back every time. This is potentially like less code, like you were saying, than you have to write for to handle a full traditional request. Anything else people can think of? Yeah, totally.
Like I'm thinking back to Tiny App.
Mhm.
If someone like gave an incorrect login, it would send the request and then that like re-render the page instead of just client side saying, hey, that's wrong.
So you get like client-side dynamic validation for your forms, less costly than doing a full request. Yeah, that's a really good one actually. What else? There's some other things. So we talked about performance. Just being able to make a single page application itself is kind of a benefit. The user experience doesn't get halted at any point between different views. You have front-weighted resource loads. So this means thinking to a page, again, we'll look at like Reddit or something, or like Facebook is a good example of this. If Facebook was done like traditionally or synchronously, and you have like a lot of posts that you have to scroll through, what is the approach? Like we might think, okay, on initial load, get in like a page of 100 posts, and when the user gets to the bottom of the page, they hit the next button, and then they get a new page of 100 posts. The first thing, there's like a balance there. If you're loading in too many like things, too many, I guess, posts, that's a lot of initial resources or a lot of data that needs to be loaded before you can show the user any content. And then the second thing, we have to tab through stuff. But what responsive like single page applications do is they just load in a few things, and then as the user gets to the bottom, they dynamically request. And sometimes when it's like fast, you don't even notice it. It's like, I'm sure this code, Reddit's always a risk to go to. But I'm sure like when you get 3 posts up, it already starts to load the other stuff. So that saves on it makes the page faster because we can spread loads throughout the application. We don't have one really heavy resource load at the beginning where we're getting everything. We can just kind of like predict when a user is about to see something and then like run and grab it and show it to them. So we get this like more even distribution of cost.
Is that sort of an event trigger? Like when you reach the end of a page, it triggers an event?
Yeah, you can have events where there's on-scroll events. You can also have events where like when an element comes into view on the page. There's different ways they could have handled it for sure. But there's also definitely cons of single-page applications. Accessibility with dynamic content is really tricky. And when we're talking about accessibility, we're thinking, how do we make our applications and our websites usable and accessible by anyone of any level of ability? A big thing that comes into play with websites and web content is screen readers. And screen readers have a really hard time. We got rid of like Reddit. But when things are like popping up and they appear at later points, and they could be appearing at different parts in the page, it's much harder to have a screen reader know or communicate what is happening to the user. So that makes it a more challenging developer experience to make our sites accessible, and it also makes browsing the web more frustrating for like people who need those tools. Asynchronous programming patterns are just more complex to code. Sometimes they save us on lines of code, but dealing with promises, like even here, we have 2 promise requests. We run the risk of like nesting our promises. We have to think about which is happening first. Dealing with asynchronous code is just a more complex problem. It requires JavaScript and XML HTTP request support. So in order for us to deliver a single-page application, the user has to be supporting or enabling JavaScript, and the browser has to support the XML HTTP request object. Because again, this object is something new that JavaScript has added over the years since back in 2000 when we were talking about it earlier. It is universally supported at this point. Any browser that like is still supported has this object, but that's not to say that there's someone out there with like an old, Windows 2000 computer running an ancient version of Explorer who doesn't have this. They might not be huge shares of the user base, but it's something to at least think of. People also disable JavaScript, and there are different reasons for like doing that. If you have really poor latency or really poor internet connection, disabling JavaScript can make your web experience faster. There's also like security concerns around JavaScript. Not that we should be worried, but some people who are overly concerned with security, they disable JavaScript for the fear of scripts getting access to our information. Just like a small example, so all of our JavaScript is only run within the client and only has access to information pertaining to this browser or this window. But people are always like super creative and sneaky with how they do things. Even here, when I go to type something, it gives me suggestions, right? And these suggestions are based on this input's name. This input's name is search. So any previous inputs that I've used that have the name search, it is going to pull up like suggestions. That's why when you go to most login register pages and you type in your email, it gives you options of all the emails that you used previously. From the client JavaScript, I can see what comes up in this dropdown. So, a security risk that people have exploited is to hide input forms behind stuff and just switch out all of the different names of that input to get as many points of information about what the suggested content is for that user. So you create an input, you call it email, you record all the emails that show up. You create an input, you call it username, you get all of the information that shows up. And you keep switching those until you get like all of the things. In a similar way, if we have a link on a page, like a classic link, I don't know if this one has like classic, wait, what? No. But like, the plain blue link, when you click on it and you've visited that page before, it now is purple. So the browser has a context of what history you've been to across your whole browser, not just across like this tab. If a link is purple, it means I've been there before. Actually, I think there's some examples. Yeah. So I clicked on science fiction, now it's a purple link. So similar to like the input field, people hide A tags and they just rotate through as many different sites as they can, and they record what sites you've been to based on that. Not that I don't know how well you can do those exploits anymore, but there's stuff like that comes up, and so there's some justification for people going into their browsers and disabling JavaScript. For those reasons, we need to think, well, we might need to think about fallbacks. It depends on both of those things. JavaScript is supported by all browsers, so is this object. Users disable it sometimes for these different reasons. And this is just a design decision that we might run into and we might have to consider. Do we care about the instances where people will not be able to use a single page application because one of these factors? If we do care about it, what are our options to design around it? Larger sites, they have the resources. They'll often create a client JavaScript version of the site, and if they detect that the user is not using JavaScript, they can serve an alternative static version of the page. Or maybe in the least case, you just serve a static version of the page that lets the user know that hey, this page isn't going to work unless you enable JavaScript. One or the other. Also, the examples we looked at, we were getting JSON from our requests. All of this information that came back was in an object. It was sent over the network as JSON. But we're not limited to JSON responses with Ajax requests. We can also get XML back. And like we talked about earlier, HTML can be formatted as XML and XHTML because they're very similar. So we have the option of sending back like new HTML snippets or documents to the user based on certain requests that they get. So like GitHub projects is one example of a case where this is done. Like if we go into GitHub, and I have week. All right, we'll just make a new project. New project. Call this the best project. So we have a project here, and they have the option of adding a new column. I'm going to open up the network tab. I click add a new column. I need a column name. So this is our demo column. And then I create a column. So we go to XHR. There's a bunch of requests that are coming back, or at least that are being created. One of them is cards. Nope. Columns. There we go. So columns is a asynchronous request. How do I hate this bottom one. How do I grow it? Whatever. It's an asynchronous request. We can look. It's a request to a certain endpoint for GitHub, but its response is a bunch of HTML. And if we look into our elements, and we look at this guy, so this HTML will be the same HTML that was received from that asynchronous request. So they're like asking their server, hey, this new thing or action is occurring. Give us all of the content that we should be inserting back into the page. So they're not doing, I mean, we didn't really do much of this today, but yesterday we saw ourselves making new HTML elements in the with JavaScript. They're doing that all on the server side, sending back a big block of it, and then from JavaScript you can decide you just want to render that whole thing in the page, you want to put it in a particular div, particular position in your document. So you have different options when you're doing these like requests. Any questions on like the pros and cons of single page, or I guess asynchronous versus traditional requests, or on Ajax itself? Cool. Another thing to think about, we're using jQuery for our requests. That's not the only way that we can do a Ajax request. We can, of course, do it with pure JavaScript. But this is also like another, remember we talked about yesterday how jQuery originally helped us with all of these big problems that were kind of, stuff was very hard to do in JavaScript, and maybe still is to some degree, but JavaScript is making it easier for us as we go. When asynchronous requests were first created, browsers had access to this XML HTTP request object. And you could create a request and then send it off and then wait for the response to come back. The number of steps to create a request with just this pure object is a lot. And it's like not the simplest way of doing things. It's by far not as simple as doing this. But there's new improvements to JavaScript. Instead of using this request object, we now have something called fetch that exists natively in the browsers. And fetch is like kind of JavaScript's implementation of this. It's a function that makes asynchronous requests. It takes in a path. It returns a promise. Oh, did you know? So console log's a function, right? And our callback, we're passing it a reference to a function. So what we can do actually, if we just want to print out the parameter that we're getting in a callback, we can actually just do that. We're passing console log as a reference. Then we'll call console log, pass it in whatever parameters it gets, and we'll get the result. So we can do a fetch there, and then we get a response. Cores, headers, the body, all of this stuff. So it's becoming easier to work with JavaScript. There's a bit of a difference between using fetch and using something like Ajax, or there's other request libraries that you can build in, like Axios is a really popular one. Our response here we got, and we were able to use right away as an object. But we talked about the data coming in is actually JSON. Ajax converts any incoming JSON directly to a JavaScript object. Fetch does not, so we have to do one extra step if we were using fetch, where we took this data and we did a JSON.parse exactly. But we have different options. Fetch is like newer. So support similar to those new CSS features we talked about is not complete yet, but you're pretty safe in most cases. Last thing we'll talk about is cores. This is something I want to make you aware of. It's not something that you guys really need to be overly comfortable with at this point, but it is a problem that comes up when we have asynchronous requests. So the first thing to think about, we have a client. The server that gives us our original information, our original like HTML document, our original single-page app, whatever we're receiving from the server, is called the origin. So the origin in our Pokédex is that lightweight HTTP server. That's called the origin. So we can make requests to the origin and get stuff back from the origin. That's completely fine. But with asynchronous requests, we can now make requests to other like servers. So the other domain that we're requesting to with our Pokédex is the Poke API. And when you make a request to something that is not your origin, that's called a cross-origin request. So all of our requests for our Pokédex is a cross-origin request. Browsers have some rules around how cross-origin requests are handled. There's a set of rules called cores, cross-origin resource sharing, like rules. It's a set of browser server enforced standards to restrict or allow cross-origin requests. CORS uses request headers to communicate authorization, yada, yada, yada. This can make it hard to request different APIs client-side, but can often be solved by setting the correct headers. So like, if we send a request and we say in our header that we should allow access from cross-origin, we'll be in most cases given access, but it also depends. Most public-facing APIs, so the Pokey API on their server, they have some configuration to allow any cross-origin requests because they know people are going to be doing what we're doing now. But if you set up your own server and then you access it from a different kind of origin, it's going to give you a CORS error. And you'll see them coming up in your network tab in the response that you're getting from the server. It'll say like CORS access restricted. You aren't going to be encountering this anytime like soon. That shouldn't come up in Twitter, shouldn't come up in like your midterms, but people start to run into this in like the finals and things like that. All I want you to take away from this right now is kind of knowing what a cross-origin resource request is. So when we're making a request not to the origin, but to another domain. The reason why this is kind of controlled is you're making requests to like a foreign entity. Like the assumption is if your server gave you this HTML document, you have like a bond of trust with that server because they know what you're going to do. The server delivered all the content, so it has prior knowledge of you as a client and what you have. And we know that our servers can set things like cookies. So they give us this document, they can set cookies for us, and so on. We just have to be careful if we're dealing with another server. Do we allow them access to our information like our cookies, things like that. This is why it's controlled more so than a normal request. Sweet. How are people feeling? Any other confusions around these last couple points? Yeah. Yeah. So Fetch is a browser API, like it's built into client-side JavaScript. So that's why I was able to just do it here. Like I'm not including anything external. Axios is like a library. So yeah, Axios is both a front and back end library. So people use it on like their Express servers to make requests really easy. You could also include it, like we would include it here in our HTML file as a script if we wanted to, and then we could make HTTP requests using their syntax, which is really nice and kind of handles a lot of issues. jQuery is fine to use as well. I guess again, the thing is, do you just want to handle requests? Then maybe you don't need to bring in the full jQuery library. Maybe you just use Axios. But if you're also using jQuery for other things, then use their asynchronous or their Ajax function for that as well. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Use a request library? I believe so. I don't think you can get, because that's the npm request. And then eventually use like the request-promise library. Where's their docs? Yeah, it looks like there's like a front-end version of request too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mhm.
Ajax.
Yeah.
So I just feel like there's a lot of that's all we know so far. There's probably more out there, right?
There are more, but those are like the big ones. It's not like there's like an infinite sea of like request libraries. Like the big ones you're going to see are like Axios and Request, and then like Fetch is just available there always. You, the thing is, they do such a similar thing that they look almost identical when you use them. Like over here, we could literally probably just go fetch, and I think fetch can take an object like that. And the only extra step we might have to do is get the JSON and do like a like that might be the only difference. We could for sure do this. So it kind of comes down to what you're familiar with, what your project is using, if you're working with other people, what their convention is. The one benefit to using something like Request and like I personally don't use Request that much. I mostly use Axios. But the one benefit I find to using Axios is that I have consistency from my front and back end. If I'm doing a request on the back end or I'm doing a request on the front end, it's the same syntax. It's like identical. If I'm using like jQuery for my Ajax requests, I have one way of doing requests on the front end, and then on the back end, maybe I'm using like request. So it's not like a terribly hard thing to jump between the two, but if you're using one for both, you just have kind of a little bit more simplicity. Yeah. Yeah, and again, like I would just like you can kind of forget about the other ones, and not be in too much danger.
When you're using Ajax on Stack Overflow, people sometimes use .then and sometimes use .done. So is there any difference between .then and .done? We are using
Done.
but there is also .done. So
Mhm.
is there any difference between .then and .done, or is it the same thing, just different?
So done then will only be triggered on a promise resolve, because like there's your promise, there's two potential states, right? It could either be resolved or it could be rejected. Thens will only happen if your thing is resolved. A .done will be triggered at whether it resolves or rejects, from my understanding. So that's kind of the difference there. You can. So I don't know what would be the reasoning for using like a .done and a .catch, but you can. Yeah. If I think of things, I'll let you know.
Sure. And another question is course. So if you go to the repeat file, MD file, and you scroll down to the course section.
Yeah. Where are we?
So for the origin, so you said it's the lightweight HTTP server, right? So on the client side, we are making requests to the server. The server then goes to whatever API we are requesting back and then brings back the data. So that's not a course rejection. But if I were to, from the client side, if I don't use that HTTP body and I'm requesting data to some other server, that's when the course error occurs. So, for example, if I'm on my laptop, like on my browser, I type google.com.
Mm-hmm.
I'm making the request to google.com.
Yeah, their server.
So why isn't it giving me a course error?
Well, so you have an origin for every site that you visit. Like the origin when you type in google.com is their server. and then when we go to Reddit, their Reddit server is the origin. It's not the server I have. It's whatever is giving me the content for that website. And you did a really good point. Like, if there's requests happening from the origin to, like, from the server to server, Cores doesn't. That's not a cross-origin thing. That's just two servers communicating with each other. It's only concerned with the client's, like, requests that are going out.
When would this course error occur in my example?
In your example with Google,
Yeah. So I want to see a course rejection or course error on my console or whatever.
nothing with Google would happen in terms of Cores. The Is this important to anyone? So the Cores error I see most often in my development and people's, like, finals, and this is, like, again, a bit ahead of where we're at right now, but eventually we're gonna have our server and our server will be maybe delivering a single page application. Once we start thinking about React, React is a project, and it's a bundle of eventually, like, a bunch of JavaScript files and HTML and CSS, and it gets sent all down as, like, a big bundle to the server or to the browser, and the browser still will make requests back to this server to get, like, maybe, like, an image. Oh no. But then we also want to have, like, an API for our application. Like, we want to store user data. Maybe we want to store information on songs and which songs users listen to. So people will make a separate server which is purely an API. Like, it doesn't give any content to any viewable content to a browser. It just returns like JSON. So then our single page application will start making requests to this server and getting stuff back for, like, JSON information. This is the cross-origin thing, and because it's a server that we created, we now need to specify that, like, hey, Cores is okay, and in our outgoing request, we also need to say, like, Cores is okay. And if we say it on both sides, then it will go fine. But if this server doesn't have some information saying Cores is okay, the request will come back and be like, hey, no, we don't know who you are. We don't want your stuff. So that's where it comes up. But again, like, it'll come in time. But super good questions. So we're kind of running out of time, but quickly, I want to add in one last function to our thing. You know, like the Who's That Pokemon game? So we're going to, where are we at? When we get a Pokemon, this search right now, like, we can put in a number or a, like, name. If a user puts in a number, like, they probably don't know what that Pokemon is, so they shouldn't be, like, in a real Pokedex, you only get to see the Pokemon that you've, like, actually found. So if I just put in, like, I don't know who 567 is. Oh, it's, of course, Archeops. So let's try and, like, blur him out so you don't get the name if we're passing in, like, a number. So down, and this is probably not the best way to do this, but down here, right before I update the Pokedex, I'm just going to check if the search is a number. And if it is, I want to set the Pokemon name to, like, question marks, and the Pokemon description, we'll also do question marks. I want to keep the image the same, but there's a cool filter effect with CSS that you can do. Well, there's a bunch of filter effects that you can do. So there's like, we can blur an image, we can change the brightness, we can do contrast, hue rotation, a bunch of stuff. But if we set the brightness down to 0, then the image will just be black. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to say if there is a Pokédex that is unidentified, the image should have a brightness of 0. So when our Pokédex also has the class unidentified. Currently it doesn't, so that won't make an effect to our it won't change our app. But what we can do here is we can conditionally apply or remove that class depending on whether they're using a number or not. So we'll use our jQuery and we'll grab the Pokédex. And if the description or if the search is a number, we'll do an add class. And we'll unidentified. If it's a name, then we can remove the class. So back over here, nice. It's blurring him out, and all the sprites thankfully are like PNGs, so we get just their outline. And that initial call was with a number. If we do the name, we get the image, and then we get the description. But then if we throw down, like, let's do we get that. But who's that Pokemon? Oh, it's Sandshrew. Yeah. What about this one? Machamp? Nah, Machamp's got. Oh, it is. No, Machamp's got the forearms. Oh, there we go. Okay, let's get some Gen 2 ones. Is it Spider? Ah! Oh, and our missing no kind of ruins because it's not a PNG. And what? I don't know what he is. Let's see if we can get. Oop. Oh yeah. Ooh. Yeah. 201. Okay, last one. Oh, this is unknown A. Does that work? Yeah, they kind of cheated in Gen 2 and just threw in like. Oh, do those guys count in the numbers? Like, are there? What was that? 251 or no 201? Is 202 just B? No, I guess. I don't know. Who's this one? I know this one. Yeah. 2 T's, 1 T. Wait. UF? Wahoo? WAUB? No, I'm doing this wrong. W4D3. No. 2 F's? What buffet? Yo, how do you spell it? Oh, that's like. That is really hard. Uh-oh. Yeah, I did. I broke it somehow. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Oh, great validation. I can't even use capitals. Sweet. Well, that's everything. Thanks for taking the time. And unless there's any other questions, we can wrap up there. And I'll send you the project and the notes and stuff you can go through later. Thanks, guys.